Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of the United States and the Cold War. In the previous lectures, we've talked about the years of World War II, focusing on diplomatic aspects, and in the previous lecture, the wartime conferences that played such a big role in the aftermath of the war and the early stages of the Cold War. There's one more important element of World War II that bears discussion as we embark on our discussion of the Cold War. That is, of course, the decision to drop the atomic bombs at the end of the war on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. This decision, it could be argued, ranks among the most important decisions in the history of humankind. A decision made essentially by one man, Harry Truman. Therefore, it's been the focal point of perhaps more scholarly attention than any other aspect of the war, as historians grapple with the realities of Truman's decision and its legacies into the decades after the war itself. And so in this lecture, we turn to a discussion of the droppings of the atomic bomb at the end of World War II and its impact into the Cold War itself. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb detonated in an armed conflict was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It came from the American bomber, the Enola Gay, and killed between 70 and 80,000 instantly, and an equal number in the days and weeks following, who died from various results of burns and radioactive poisoning. 3 days later, on August 9th, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, having similar effects on that city as well. Collectively, the two bombings forced the end of the war. Any hope of Japanese victory in the war was erased, and thus even the Japanese, who dreaded surrender almost as much as death itself, were compelled to surrender for the mere prospect of saving the lives of the remaining citizens of that nation. And so on September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, ending the war. The Missouri itself was appropriate for a number of symbolic reasons. It was a ship that had been sunk in the attack at Pearl Harbor, and raised and repaired, and now was a fitting scene for the end of the war itself. Missouri was also the home state of the President of the United States, Harry Truman, who had made the decision to drop the bombs themselves. The atomic bombs exacted a horrific human toll and material toll on the cities that they were dropped upon. The deaths of many of those who were killed by the bombs were agonizing and extended out for days and weeks as they suffered unimaginable pain and suffering from the burns and the radiation of the bombings. So it must be wondered, why did Harry Truman make the decision to drop the bombs? And was it necessary to bring the war to an end? Or was there more to those decisions than the actual military impact they would have? These are the kind of questions that Cold War historians have grappled with from those days of 1945 up to the present. In making the decision to drop the atomic bombs, Harry Truman unleashed an unimaginable, strange new force onto the world. Of course, the ominous mushroom cloud that is so familiar to us now made this weapon unlike anything that had been seen before. The atomic bombs also came with a blinding light, a strange atomic blinding flash, and an atomic wind that swept down almost anything in its path. Those who observed the bombings and the aftermath in some cases believed we had unleashed the forces of hell onto the planet. And so we have to grapple with the reality of that decision and try to figure out whether it was absolutely necessary or whether it could have been avoided. Certainly, the factors involving the military defeat of Japan as the war came to its final stages were a significant aspect of the decision. And there was great debate between Truman and many of his policy advisors and military advisors as to how they should proceed in the final stages of the war. The fighting in the Pacific had been unimaginably brutal, which was one factor in the decision. Japanese soldiers, in essence, did not believe in surrender, and so they fought to the last man, and there were many incredibly vicious battles on the small volcanic islands that dotted the Pacific on the way towards Japan itself. And so the prospect of trying to uproot and defeat the entire Japanese populace on their massive home islands was a prospect that many American officials did not relish. It wasn't entirely clear, though, to what extent Japan was willing to fight to the bitter end if, in fact, an invasion of Japan itself became necessary. And so Truman wrestled with two different options as the war reached its later stages. Preparing for an invasion of Japan itself, and that operation was known as Operation Downfall, and preparations were in place for such an invasion of the big islands of Japan. Or utilizing this horrible and strange new weapon that no one fully understood what the impact might be if it were used. However, Truman and his advisors did understand that if it was used and if it worked to its full effect, it would exact a horrible and shocking toll upon the enemy that would make surrender a much more appealing prospect than continuing to fight the war. So to what extent did Truman's policy and military advisors believe it was necessary to use the bomb to end the war? Well, there continues to be debate about this. Although, as I mentioned, the preparations for a land invasion of Japan were underway, and estimates did anticipate that it was going to be a massive invasion with the potential for massive casualties on both sides. Now, of course, casualties on the American side were the gravest concern from Truman's perspective, although there were those who predicted as many as more than 20 million Japanese might perish in a land invasion of the islands themselves. According to a study conducted in June of 1945 by the Joint War Plans Committee, some 25 to 46,000 American troops might die in an invasion of Japan itself. This is relatively low compared to the hundreds of thousands and perhaps even millions that some anticipated of such an invasion. The reasons for that estimate were that the Japanese were closer to surrender than others might believe, and that they had already been weakened by other attacks that had been launched against Japan, most notably a steady campaign of firebombings that had exacted a horrible toll in the months leading up to the droppings of the atomic bomb. The firebombings of Tokyo, which had been done on March 9th and 10th, 1945, alone killed more than 100,000 people and exacted massive destruction on the city itself. Many of Japan's largest cities had been subjected to similar attacks, and so some historians note the firebombings that had already been done on Japan were almost as damaging as the dropping of the atomic bombs themselves. As damaging as the firebombings had been, though, they didn't exact the same kind of total and utter destruction that the atomic bombs did. These are the words of one witness to the bombing at Hiroshima, a high school student named Yoshi Oka, who said, "Hiroshima has been attacked by a new type of bomb. The city is in a state of near total destruction." The shock value of this kind of destruction was certainly one thing that Harry Truman had in mind when he decided to use the bombs. Fire bombings, other sorts of attacks, even a land invasion, could not compel the enemy to surrender as quickly and assuredly as the massive and devastating destruction of the atomic bombs. And so Harry Truman said in 1945, after the dropping of the first bomb, "If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." And while in fact it would have taken some time to build and develop more bombs, the Japanese didn't know that. And so they did indeed envision a rain of ruin coming from the air. And there's no question that dropping the atomic bombs hastened the end of the war. If military and policy experts agree that the war would have been brought to an end probably sooner than most had expected, whether by land invasion or other means, why did Truman decide to use the atomic bomb, which he knew would kill many tens of thousands of civilians, even in the best case scenario? Historians have speculated about many different reasons for this. Some point to Truman's personality, which, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, involved what some describe as a Napoleon complex. He was always trying to demonstrate his power, and in this case, he became the most powerful person in the world by dropping the atomic bomb and utilizing the most powerful weapon that had ever been invented. There were also those who believed that the atomic bomb was in some ways simply the next logical step in a war that had featured many different technological developments and new kinds of weapons. I mentioned the fire bombings a moment ago, which were already exacting an enormous toll, an enormous amount of damage. The bomb had been developed, it was ready to go, it had been tested, and so there are those who would argue, all's fair in love and war. We've got this weapon. We need to use it. We didn't invest the money not to use it. More compelling, though, are arguments that point us in the direction of what would become the Cold War. As noted a moment ago, it's inarguable that the use of the bombs shortened the war. Everyone agrees on this. So while a land invasion would ultimately have forced the surrender of Japan, and perhaps would not have been as deadly and devastating on American forces as the worst estimates expected, it still would have taken a lot of time. It would have been very expensive and drawn out over months and perhaps even years. No one can know what that land invasion might have looked like. The other factor involved, though, was that the Soviets were on the brink of joining the war. And in fact, they signed on to the war effort against Japan on the same day that the second bomb was dropped at Nagasaki. This was by virtue of the agreements that we discussed in previous lectures at Yalta and Potsdam. And so if Truman and the Americans could shorten the war and, in effect, win the war without the help of the Soviets, this would strengthen their position in negotiations in the aftermath of the war. And many historians believe this was a significant factor on Truman's mind when he decided to use the bomb instead of other options. In effect, we won the war on our own without Soviet aid, and so we had to give them less in the post-war settlement. This leads to the final element of this picture, which some scholars have argued, that this is the first step in what's come to be known as atomic diplomacy. That in fact, Truman was utilizing the bomb and its use or not use, and his own possession of the bomb and knowledge of it and secrets of it, as opposed to sharing it with others, as part of his diplomatic plan. This is atomic diplomacy. And so by dropping the atomic bomb, Truman was not only, in a military sense, attacking an enemy in Japan that we were on the verge of defeating anyway, but he was showing the rest of the world, and most pointedly showing Stalin and the Soviets, that we possessed this weapon and that we were willing to use such a weapon. This would become a hugely important element in what would become the Cold War going forward, because everyone now understood that the United States had this bomb and had this weapon, and no one else did at that time. And so there are those that argue that it was these reasons, directing the attack not just at Japan, but in a powerful symbolic way at Stalin and the Soviets, that these were the primary reasons that Truman decided to drop the atomic bomb. Whatever his reasons, by dropping the atomic bomb, Truman had unleashed this powerful new weapon on the world. He had opened Pandora's box, if you will, never to be returned. Never again would we as human beings live in a world without the prospect of nuclear annihilation. Instantaneous death at the hands of a weapon like this would overshadow our lives from those days in August of 1945 up to the present day. And in many ways, the threat of nuclear annihilation still hangs over us today.